The low hum of conversation in the restaurant was a familiar sort of music, a blend of clinking silverware, muted laughter, and the gentle scraping of chairs against the wooden floor. It was a sound I usually found comforting, the soundtrack to family gatherings that were meant to be milestones of connection. But tonight, it felt different. It felt like noise, a wall of sound that was pushing my little girl further and further into the shadows. Sophie sat beside me, her small legs, clad in sparkly tights, swinging gently beneath her chair. She wasn't speaking, but her silence was louder to me than any word she could have uttered. Her eyes, usually so bright and curious, were fixed on the pristine white of her untouched bread plate. She had tried a few times to join the conversation. Her voice, sweet and high-pitched, had piped up with a story about a caterpillar she had found in the garden that morning, its tiny legs tickling her palm. She'd looked directly at her grandfather, my father, her face alight with the simple joy of the discovery. He had nodded vaguely, his attention already snagged by my brother's louder, more adult story about a frustrating day at the office. A few minutes later, she tried again. This time, it was a question for her aunt, my sister, about the colorful bangles on her wrist. "Are they magic?" she had whispered, her voice filled with a childlike wonder that could melt the coldest of hearts. Or so I thought. My sister smiled, a fleeting, distracted thing, before turning back to her husband, laughing at a joke I hadn't caught. Each attempt was a small boat she launched into the vast ocean of adult conversation, and each time, it was swallowed by the waves without a ripple. I watched as her shoulders, once so straight and proud in her new velvet dress, began to curve inward. Her bright, hopeful smile slowly faded, replaced by a trembling lip she was trying desperately to control. I reached for her hand under the table, my fingers lacing through hers. She squeezed back, a silent acknowledgement of my presence. But she didn't look at me. Her gaze remained downcast, her world shrinking to the size of that empty plate. The main course arrived, a flurry of waiters and steaming dishes that momentarily broke the flow of conversation. For a brief moment, I hoped it would be a reset, a chance for Sophie to find an opening. But the talk simply picked up where it left off, circling around topics she couldn't possibly grasp. Mortgage rates, office politics, the rising cost of gasoline. It was a world she wasn't a part of, and no one was making an effort to build her a bridge. I saw the first tear trace a silent path down her cheek, catching the dim restaurant light like a tiny diamond. She swiped at it quickly, hoping no one would notice. But I noticed. A mother always notices. Another tear followed, and then another. A quiet, heartbreaking sob escaped her, a sound so full of hurt that it physically pained me. That was it. The wall of noise, the casual indifference, the unintentional cruelty of being invisible. It had finally broken her. Without a word, I pushed my chair back. I scooped her up from her seat, her small body trembling against mine. She buried her face in the crook of my neck, her tears soaking the collar of my blouse. I could feel the stares of my family, the sudden awkward silence as they finally registered that something was wrong. I heard my mother's voice, a concerned, "Sarah, is everything all right?" But I didn't answer. I just held my daughter, my arms wrapped tightly around her, and walked away from the table. Away from the half-eaten meals and the conversations that had no room for a little girl's story about a caterpillar. We found a quiet corner near a large potted fern, away from the prying eyes and the sudden, unwelcome concern. There, I just held her, rocking her gently, my hand stroking her soft hair. She didn't need words or explanations from me. She just needed to be held. She needed to feel seen, to be the center of someone's universe, even if just for a moment, in a quiet corner of a busy restaurant. She cried for the sting of being ignored, for the loneliness that can be felt even in a room full of family. And as I held her, my own heart ached, not just for her pain, but for the beautiful secret I carried, a secret that connected her to a love that was deeper and older than this fleeting, painful moment. She didn't know it yet, but a queen had left her a crown. She just didn't know her great-grandma Rose had left her a ring. We stayed in our quiet corner for what felt like a long time, the large, waxy leaves of the fern providing a fragile sort of sanctuary. The sounds of the restaurant, which had been so overwhelming just moments before, now seemed distant and muffled, as if coming from another world. My world was right here, in my arms, and it was a world of shuddering breaths and damp, tear-streaked cheeks. "They don't like my stories," Sophie finally whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. She had lifted her head from my shoulder, her big blue eyes, so like my own, swimming with a hurt that was far too deep for a 6-year-old. "Oh, sweetie, that's not true," I murmured, my hand continuing its soothing rhythm on her back. They love you very much. They're just loud. They're too busy, she corrected me, and the simple, brutal honesty of it struck me. It wasn't malice or dislike that had wounded her. It was simple, thoughtless neglect. She was a quiet melody in an orchestra of booming brass, and she had been drowned out. Yes, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. They are too busy. I kissed the top of her head, inhaling the sweet, familiar scent of her shampoo. But that's their loss, Sophie. Because your story about the caterpillar was the most interesting story I'd heard all night. A small, watery smile touched her lips. Really? Absolutely, I said, meeting her gaze with all the sincerity I possessed. Tell me again. Did he have fuzzy antennae? And so she did. She told me the whole story again, this time just for me. She described the caterpillar's determined crawl across her hand, the way its fuzzy body tickled her skin, the two tiny black antennae that twitched with curiosity. I listened, truly listened, asking questions, my focus entirely on her. I saw the light slowly return to her eyes, the hurt receding as she was given the space to be heard. As she finished, a sense of calm settled over her, the storm of her emotions having passed. It was in that quiet moment, watching the life and confidence seep back into my daughter's face, that I knew it was time. Time to give her a piece of armor, a shield forged from the love of a woman she'd never met, but whose strength ran in her very veins. It was time to tell her about Rose. Sophie, I began, my voice soft. I have a secret to tell you, a very special one. It's a story about my grandmother, your great-grandma Rose. Sophie's eyes widened. She loved stories about the olden days, as she called them. She snuggled closer, her body now relaxed against mine, ready to listen. When I was a little girl, I started, a little older than you are now, my Grandma Rose was my favorite person in the whole world. She didn't live with us, but she lived close by, in a small house with a big garden, much bigger than ours. And her garden was magical. It was filled with the most amazing flowers, but her favorites were the roses. She had red ones and yellow ones and pink ones that smelled like candy. Like candy? Sophie murmured, captivated. Exactly like candy, I smiled. But Grandma Rose wasn't just a gardener. She was quiet, like you. When there were big family dinners, with lots of people talking loud and all at once, she wouldn't try to shout over them. Instead, she would find the quietest person in the room and make them feel like they were the only person in the world. I could see Sophie picturing it, her imagination painting a picture of this quiet woman with the magical garden. She would lean in close, I continued, lowering my own voice to a conspiratorial whisper, and she'd say, "Tell me a secret, little bird." Well, that's what she called me, little bird. And I would tell her things I wouldn't tell anyone else. I told her I was afraid of thunderstorms. I told her I had a crush on a boy in my class. And she would listen, her eyes never leaving my face. She made my small stories feel big and important. I paused, the memory so vivid I could almost smell the faint scent of rosewater and soil that always clung to my grandmother. Before she went to heaven, I said gently, she gave me something. Something for you. She never got to meet you, but she knew all about you. I used to talk to her about you when you were still growing in my tummy. I told her I hoped you would have her kind heart and her gentle spirit. And so she left you a gift, a piece of her magic, to keep you safe and to always remind you that even the quietest voices deserve to be heard. I reached into the small purse I had slung over my chair. My fingers fumbled for a moment before closing around the small velvet-covered box. It felt warm in my hand, a conduit to the past, a vessel of love passed down through generations. I pulled it out, keeping it hidden in my palm. She left you a crown, my Sophie, I whispered, my own eyes now beginning to sting with tears. A tiny crown, meant for the finger of a queen. I opened my hand and revealed the box. It was old, the dark blue velvet worn smooth in places. Sophie looked at it, then up at me, her face a mixture of confusion and awe. With trembling fingers, she reached out and took it from me. Sophie held the small, worn box in her hands as if it were a captured bird. Her breathing was shallow, a quiet counterpoint to the distant clatter of the restaurant. For a moment, she just stared at it, her thumb tracing the smooth, velvety surface. Then, with the careful precision of a child handling something precious, she worked her little fingers under the lid and opened it. The box didn't spring open. The old hinge gave way with a soft, almost inaudible sigh, revealing the treasure nestled inside. It wasn't a crown of sparkling diamonds, No grand, glittering jewel like the ones in her storybooks. It was something far more intimate, far more real. Lying on a bed of faded cream-colored satin was a simple, delicate gold ring. It was thin and elegant, but the centerpiece was a tiny, exquisitely carved rose, its petals layered with a realism that belied its small size. It wasn't shiny. It had the soft, warm glow of old gold, a luster that spoke of time and touch. Sophie let out a soft gasp. She didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, she looked up at me, her eyes wide with a question she couldn't articulate. "That was Grandma Rose's ring," I explained, my voice just for her. "She wore it every single day. She wore it when she was in her magical garden, tending to her roses. She said it was her reminder that even small, quiet things can be beautiful and strong." I gently took the ring from the box. She told me that the rose was the queen of flowers, but it didn't need to shout to be noticed. Its beauty and its fragrance were enough. People who took the time to look, people who were patient and quiet themselves, they were the ones who truly appreciated it. I took Sophie's small hand in mine. Her fingers were so tiny, her skin still holding the soft plumpness of early childhood. The ring was far too big for her, of course. I slid it onto her index finger where it sat loosely, a golden circle of promise. "It's a little big now," I said softly, "but you'll grow into it. Until then, it's a secret, a reminder. When you feel like no one is listening, when you feel small and quiet in a loud room, you can just touch your crown and remember Grandma Rose. You can remember that your voice, your stories, they matter. They are as beautiful as any rose in her garden." Sophie was utterly captivated. She stared at the ring on her finger, turning her hand this way and that, watching the soft light of the restaurant glint off the carved petals. She touched the tiny rose with the thumb of her other hand, a look of profound seriousness on her face. She wasn't just looking at a piece of jewelry. She was looking at a story, a legacy, a piece of magic made just for her. The tears, the hurt from earlier, it all seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a quiet, newfound strength. "A queen's crown," she whispered to herself, the words a sacred incantation. After another minute of silent communion with her ring, she looked at me, a real, genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. "Can we go back now?" "Of course, sweetie," I said, my heart swelling with a mixture of love and relief. I stood up, taking her hand in mine. The ring was a warm, solid presence between our palms. Our return to the table was met with a few raised eyebrows and concerned looks. The conversation, which had faltered in our absence, had resumed, but it was more subdued now. "Is she okay?" my mother asked, her eyes searching mine for an explanation. "She's fine," I said, my voice calm and even. I helped Sophie back into her chair. For a few moments, she was quiet, just as before. She looked at her plate, then at the faces of her family. But this time, something was different. Her shoulders were straight. Her chin was up. She wasn't shrinking. She sat there, a quiet little queen on her throne, the secret of her power gleaming on her finger. Then, she did something that surprised even me. She turned to my mother, her grandmother. She held up her hand, the gold ring catching the light. "Grandma," she said, her voice not loud, but clear and steady. "Look what Mommy gave me. It's a crown. From Great-Grandma Rose." The effect was instantaneous. All conversation stopped. Every head at the table turned, not just with fleeting curiosity, but with genuine, focused attention. My mother's face softened, a wave of nostalgia and love washing over her features as she recognized the ring. "Oh, sweetie," she breathed, reaching across the table to take Sophie's hand. "Rose's ring. It looks so beautiful on you." For the first time all night, the ocean of adult conversation parted, and Sophie's small boat sailed right through. My father, who had been holding forth about interest rates just a few minutes prior, leaned forward, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. He squinted at the tiny ring on Sophie's finger. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that softened the stern lines around his mouth. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice softer than I'd heard it all evening. "Rose's ring. I haven't seen that in 50 years. My sister, her own flashy bangles forgotten, reached out and gently took Sophie's hand from my mother. "I remember that ring," she said, her voice filled with a surprising tenderness. "Grandma Rose was wearing it the day she taught me how to bake apple pie. She let me wear it for a minute while I kneaded the dough. I felt so grown up." Sophie listened to these shared snippets of memory, her eyes moving from one face to the next. She was no longer an outsider looking in. She was the custodian of a key, a key that was unlocking a room full of memories for everyone at the table. She was the center, not because she was loud or demanding, but because she held a piece of their collective heart in her hand. She told me it was a queen's crown, Sophie announced proudly, her voice gaining strength. My mother laughed, a warm, genuine sound. That sounds exactly like her. She always had a way of making you feel special, didn't she, Sarah? She looked at me, her eyes shining, and for the first time that night, I felt truly connected to her as well. We weren't just a mother and daughter sitting at a tense family dinner. We were two women sharing a legacy, passing it down to a third. She did, I agreed, my voice thick with emotion. She called me little bird. She called me sunshine, my sister added, a wistful look on her face. She called me chief, my brother chimed in from across the table, and we all laughed. It was true. Rose had a special name for everyone, a small, unique term of endearment that made you feel seen. The food on our plates grew cold, completely forgotten. The conversation about mortgages and office politics had vanished, replaced by a much richer, more meaningful dialogue. My brother started telling a story about how Grandma Rose had helped him build a go-kart, how she'd sat patiently for hours, holding nails for him, her hands adorned with that simple gold ring, steady and sure. My sister recounted the time Rose had found her crying after she'd fallen off her bike, and instead of fussing, she'd simply cleaned the scrape and then distracted her by pointing out the shapes of animals in the clouds. Each story was a small, polished stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples spreading out to touch all of us. I watched Sophie as she listened, completely absorbed. She was learning about her great-grandmother not from a list of facts or dates, but from the living, breathing memories of the people who had loved her. She was learning that Rose wasn't just a name or a face in a faded photograph. She was a woman who built go-karts, baked pies, and saw animals in the clouds. She was a woman who understood what it felt like to be small and hurt. Sophie, in her innocent way, began to ask questions. Did she like caterpillars? She asked my father. He chuckled. She loved everything in her garden, Sophie. Caterpillars, butterflies, even the grumpy old toad that lived under the porch steps. Did she sing songs? She asked my sister. All the time, my sister replied. Old songs mostly. Ones her own mother had taught her. She had a very soft, sweet voice. It was magical. My daughter, who had been silenced by the disinterest of her family, was now leading the conversation. She was the conductor of this symphony of memories, her simple, curious questions drawing out stories that had lain dormant for years. She had, with the help of a tiny gold ring, reminded everyone at the table of a part of themselves they had forgotten. She had reminded them of a time when their own stories were small and important, a time when a quiet woman with a magical garden had made them feel like the center of the universe. As I looked at her, sitting there so confidently, her finger occasionally stroking the tiny carved rose, I saw the truth of my grandmother's lesson. Strength wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about knowing your own value. The ring hadn't magically made everyone listen. It had given Sophie the confidence to believe she was worth listening to. It was a tangible link to a love that had existed long before she was born, a love that would continue long after, a love that told her, without words, that she mattered. The rest of the dinner passed in a warm haze of shared stories and laughter. The waiters came and cleared our plates, brought dessert, and refilled our water glasses, but the spell was not broken. The atmosphere had been transformed. The wall of noise was gone, replaced by a tapestry of connection, woven with the threads of memory. And at the center of it all sat my daughter, my quiet little queen, her crown glowing softly in the candlelight. The drive home was a stark contrast to the journey there. The earlier tension that had crackled in the air, a product of my own anxiety about the evening, had completely dissolved. In its place was a soft, peaceful quiet. The streetlights painted fleeting stripes of gold across the car's interior, illuminating the contented expression on Sophie's face. She was in her booster seat, her head leaning against the window, her eyes watching the city lights blur past. She hadn't said much since we'd left the restaurant, but it wasn't the withdrawn silence of before. This was a thoughtful silence, a comfortable quiet filled with the weight of new knowledge and old stories. The ring was back in its velvet box, which she clutched in her lap with both hands. She had insisted on carrying it herself. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Her thumb was gently stroking the worn velvet, much as she had stroked the tiny carved rose itself. "Did you have a good time tonight, sweetie?" I asked, my voice soft so as not to break the spell. She turned her head to look at me, her eyes reflecting the passing lights. "I learned about Grandma Rose's toad," she said, as if this were the most significant piece of information in the world. And perhaps to her, it was. It wasn't the story of a great accomplishment or a dramatic event. It was a detail of a life, a small, intimate fact that made her great-grandmother real. I didn't know about the toad either, I confessed. Or that she called Uncle David Chief. I learned new things tonight, too. Her crown isn't a secret anymore, Sophie stated. No, I agreed. I guess it isn't. But the magic is still there. The magic was for you, and it looks like you shared a little bit of it with everyone else. She seemed to ponder this for a moment. It's because they remembered her, she said with the simple clarity of a child. When they saw the ring, they remembered her stories, and then they wanted to hear mine. I felt a lump form in my throat. She understood. She understood in a way that was deeper and more intuitive than any explanation I could have ever given her. She understood that the ring wasn't a magic wand that commanded attention. It was a catalyst for connection. It was a bridge to a shared past, and by holding it, she had become the keeper of that bridge. When we got home, the usual bedtime routine took on a new, ceremonial quality. After Sophie had brushed her teeth and changed into her pajamas, she walked over to her small bedside table. She placed the velvet box squarely in the center, next to her lamp and a treasured smooth gray stone she had found on the beach last summer. She opened the box and looked at the ring for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "Mommy," she said, her voice serious. "When I'm big and I have a little girl, can I give her the crown?" The question was so full of love, so full of an understanding of the change she was now a part of, that it took my breath away. "Of course, my love," I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. "That's exactly what you're supposed to do." She smiled, a deep, knowing smile, and carefully closed the lid. I tucked her into bed, the blankets pulled up to her chin. I leaned down to kiss her forehead. "Good night, my little queen," I whispered. She wrapped her arms around my neck, her small body warm and solid. "Good night, Mommy. Thank you for the secret." I left her room, leaving the door slightly ajar as I always did, the soft glow from her lamp spilling into the hallway. I walked into the living room, but I didn't turn on the lights. I stood by the large window, looking out at the dark, sleeping houses of our neighborhood. The evening had started with such pain and frustration. I had been so wrapped up in my own anger at my family's casual thoughtlessness, so focused on the injustice of my daughter's invisibility. I had wanted to protect her, to shield her from the hurt of being overlooked, but I had ended up doing so much more. By sharing Rose's legacy, I had given Sophie something far more powerful than a shield. I had given her a root, an anchor that tethered her to the generations of quiet strength that had come before her. My grandmother, Rose, had been gone for years, but she had been more present tonight than she had been in a very long time. Her love, her wisdom, her quiet way of seeing the world had been resurrected through the telling of stories, sparked by a simple gold ring. She had known. Somehow she had known that her legacy wouldn't be found in grand gestures or material wealth, but in the small, passed-down acts of love that ripple through time. She had known that the quietest people often have the most to say, if only someone would take the time to listen. Tonight, my daughter had not learned to be louder. She had learned that she didn't have to be. She had learned that her own quiet power, the power of her stories, her curiosity, and her kind heart, was enough. The ring on her bedside table wasn't a crown of dominion, but a crown of dignity. It was a reminder that true strength isn't about commanding a room, but about commanding the respect of others, simply by being yourself. It was a lesson my grandmother had lived, a lesson I had tried to teach, and a lesson my daughter, in her own beautiful way, had now taught to us all. The queen was not gone. She was just sleeping peacefully, dreaming, no doubt, of gardens and caterpillars and grumpy, beloved toads.